There was a lake that no map named, though it was never truly hidden. It sat quietly between folds of rolling hills, where the earth held its breath and the sky dipped low to listen. Travelers rarely came across it by chance. It was not on the way to anything, nor did it call attention to itself. But those who arrived always had a reason, even if they couldn't explain it. The path was never marked, yet always known. Some described a tug in their chest, others a recurring dream. No one ever planned a visit. They simply arrived, and the lake was waiting. The water never rippled unless touched. No wind stirred it. It was as if it had made an agreement with time not to move unless moved. The trees nearby grew at odd angles, leaning forward as if in attendance, not overgrown, but attentive. There was no dock, no boat, no sign of human shaping. Yet at the edge of the lake stood a single wooden box, always dry, always empty, except when it wasn't. Letters appeared inside from time to time, folded carefully or crumpled in haste. No stamps, no addresses, only handwriting, sometimes shaky, sometimes elegant, always private. People came here to let go, of grief, of guilt, of things they had never said. They brought their letters and stood in silence. Some wept, some lingered, some simply dropped the paper and turned away. The lake accepted each one without question. When a letter was placed gently on its surface, it floated, not soggy, not sinking. It would drift slowly toward the center, then vanish beneath the water without ever breaking apart. No bubbles, no splash, only absence. No one had ever admitted to receiving anything back. And yet they returned, some years later, others season after season, as if the lake was the only witness who remembered correctly. Whispers traveled among those who had been, that on certain nights, when the sky was neither dark nor light, the lake would offer something in return. Not a letter, not words, but a moment, a memory, a reflection never lived but still familiar. And for those few who lingered long enough, the past sometimes leaned forward, touched their shoulder, and reminded them of something they had once promised to forget. He had never believed in rituals, not the kind with candles or incense or ceremonial gestures. But when he reached the lake that first time, he realized that some places invented their own forms of reverence, and you followed them not because you were told to, but because silence asked you to. The path to the water was soft beneath his feet, scattered with leaves that didn't crunch, only shifted gently, as though they too were remembering something. He held the folded letter inside his coat, not because he feared losing it, but because its weight belonged close to the body. He hadn't intended to write it. He hadn't even meant to bring it. But it had written itself over time, line by line, in the way he avoided certain streets, or stopped speaking to familiar names in his phone, or listened too long to messages that had ended years ago. It wasn't a long letter. In fact, most of it was white space. The sentences were short, the meanings longer. He had scratched out 3 different openings before settling on none. The paper began with silence and ended without a goodbye. He had tucked it into his coat pocket that morning without decision, only motion. He couldn't recall what made him walk toward the edge of the city, but somehow the trees began to gather and the buildings stopped following him, and the sky took on the stillness of memory. When he arrived at the lake, it didn't look ancient or magical. It looked waiting, as if it had always known someone would come without knowing why. It had no reflections, no shimmer, just a surface that seemed not to be water, but something older than water, something that did not show you what was above, but hinted at what lay below. He stood at the shore and breathed, which felt foreign, as if he hadn't done it in a while. There was no sound except the slow rhythm of his own hesitation. Then, without ceremony, he unfolded the letter one last time. He did not read it. He didn't need to. The words were carved into him already. With careful fingers, he knelt and placed it on the surface. It did not sink. It did not soak. It floated, as if obeying an agreement it had made before being written. The paper moved without breeze, drifting inward with deliberate stillness, until it reached a place where it was no longer visible, but had not disappeared. It had become part of the lake. He remained at the edge for some time, not waiting, not watching, simply being there in the aftermath of letting go. Nothing changed, and yet something did. A pressure beneath his collarbone loosened. The usual knot behind his ribs seemed absent. The world did not congratulate him. The sky did not brighten. But as he walked away, each step felt less like leaving and more like continuing. Behind him the lake remained unmoved, quiet, and whole. But within him, something had gently shifted, something that no longer needed to be held. He did not return because he hoped for something more. He returned because something inside him had grown quiet, and he wanted to remember what silence felt like outside of himself. Time had passed, though he did not count it. The seasons had folded into one another without his permission, and the letter he had given the lake had stopped echoing in his chest. But the absence it left behind was not empty. It was clean, like a room just swept, still smelling of dust but ready for breath. He did not bring another letter. He did not bring intention. Only his body, his footsteps, his presence. And as he neared the lake, he noticed how the trees leaned in ways they hadn't before, not changing direction, but seeming to acknowledge his return. He sat at the water's edge with his knees drawn in. He did not ask questions. He did not name feelings. He simply allowed the stillness to reach into him again. It was not comfort that the lake gave. It was honesty. It stripped away the performance of healing, the theatrics of grief, and left behind something unspoken but familiar. That day, as he watched the surface, a ripple formed where there had been none. It was not caused by wind, for the air was utterly still. From the center, something pale drifted toward him, slow, purposeful, unbothered by physics. A folded paper, square and silent, as if it had taken a long journey from nowhere. He did not reach for it. He waited. It floated until it kissed the shoreline, paused, then nudged against the pebbles like a breath asking to be noticed. Only then did he pick it up. It was dry, not newly placed, not aged, just present. Inside was a single sheet, blank to the eye but heavy in the hand. As he held it, images passed through him, not visions, not dreams, but sensations. The warmth of a shoulder once leaned against, the ache of a word never said, the shiver of a door that had closed too slowly. The page contained nothing and everything. It was not a response to his letter. It was a mirror to it, the kind of mirror that does not show your face, but your weight. He placed the paper back onto the water. It did not float away this time. It sank without resistance, without farewell. And in that quiet descent he felt a part of himself go with it. Not lost, but returned. There was a woman he once knew whose voice he could no longer recall, but whose silences he remembered perfectly. She had left without parting words, and he had continued life as if absence were a natural companion. But on some mornings, when the wind moved through curtains before the day truly began, he felt her decisions stir in the room beside him. She had left behind only small traces, an unclaimed mug, a plant that never bloomed again, and a folded letter he found tucked inside a book she had never finished. He had never opened it. Somehow he had always known it wasn't his to read. But the lake accepted letters not meant for eyes, only for release. One morning, as the sun hovered in a sky neither gray nor gold, he took the letter with him. It felt warm in his hand, like it had been waiting. The walk to the lake was slower this time, not heavy, just aware. He felt every root underfoot, every shift of light between branches. By the time he arrived, the lake was already awake. The surface held the color of old film, and the wind smelled faintly of oranges, though there were no trees that could bear fruit nearby. He stood for a while, the letter held loosely in his palm. He did not ask the lake for permission. He simply stepped forward, lowered his hand, and let the folded paper slip from his fingers. It landed softly and began to drift, turning slightly as if reading its own contents. He He watched until it reached the center, then waited longer. The sun continued its slow climb. Birds did not sing. The world seemed to honor the pause. Then, from the middle of the lake, something rose. Not a letter, not a message. Just a single petal, ivory and translucent, curled at the edge. It floated toward him and stopped before reaching shore. He did not touch it. He only knelt beside it, knees in the mud, breath still. And in that moment he remembered the exact rhythm of her silence, the space between her words, the inhale she never released, the turning away that never felt cruel, only unfinished. The petal drifted back to the lake on its own. He began writing again, not for others, but for himself, letters addressed to versions of him that had existed only briefly. The boy who waited at the hospital door but never stepped inside, the man who left the party early and never explained why, the one who answered the phone too late, and the one who never called at all. Each letter was brief, not because there was little to say, but because the words came only when they needed to, not when summoned. He kept them in a small wooden box beneath his bed, and every so often he would open it, not to reread, but to remember the weight of having once needed to say something. When the box grew full, he didn't think about what to do. His hands knew before his mind did. He packed it gently, lined it with an old scarf, and carried it back to the lake. The path was familiar now, not worn, but known. Like a song remembered only in the chorus, the lake welcomed him with its usual indifference. It did not shine, it did not stir, it simply was, and in its being it gave permission. One by one he placed the letters on the surface. They did not sink immediately. They floated as if considering their journey. Some spun in place, others drifted swiftly. None resisted. As the last letter left his fingers, he felt a lightness he did not associate with relief. It was more like space had opened inside him where once there had been weight. The lake did not change, but he did. And when he turned to leave, he noticed something new carved into the wood of the old letterbox by the edge, a phrase etched faintly, weathered but clear. Not all things need to be answered to be heard. He touched the carving lightly, not to confirm it was real, but to thank it for being seen. Then he walked away, slower this time, not from heaviness, but from reverence. Years became pages, and the lake remained unwritten by time. Others began to arrive, some young, some with eyes already aged. They brought their letters, or sometimes only their thoughts, and stood as he once had, with hesitation wrapped in quiet. He did not speak to them. No one did. The lake asked for presence, not instruction, but he noticed them. The way they held paper close to the heart. The way they knelt, not out of worship, but understanding. He came less frequently, though not out of forgetfulness. The lake had become a part of him, not as a place, but as a rhythm. When memories stirred or questions returned, he did not always need to walk the path. Sometimes closing his eyes was enough. One evening, just before the sky turned the color of ash, he saw a child by the water's edge, small, unsure, holding something folded in both hands. He stayed hidden among the trees, not out of secrecy, but respect. The child placed the letter on the water without trembling, watched it float, then turned away. As they passed him, their eyes met for just a moment. There was no fear, only recognition, of grief not yet named, and the courage to release it anyway. He waited until the child had gone, then stepped forward. The lake was still. The letter had disappeared. But something lingered in the air, a faint hum, a stillness deeper than silence. He did not write anymore. He did not need to, but he understood now. The lake was never about letting go. It was about witnessing the part of us that still remembered, and giving it someplace to rest. In the final light of that day, he stood at the water's edge, not as someone with something to leave behind, but as someone who had learned to carry things differently. He closed his eyes, placed his palm gently over the place where old weight once lived, and for the first time in his life, heard nothing but peace. There was a time when the lake began to recede, not visibly, not by inches or measure, but by feeling. The path was the same. The trees still leaned as they always had. But those who returned spoke of something missing, not a thing, but a sense, as if the lake had retreated a little deeper into itself, asking for quiet in a quieter tone. He felt it too, though he did not speak of it. He only watched. The last time he had come, the water had greeted him with its usual stillness, but now it felt further away, as though the space between his offering and its acceptance had grown longer, not in distance, but in understanding. He wondered if the lake could forget, not forget in anger, but simply dissolve into its own solitude, tired of holding so much that wasn't its own. Perhaps the weight of so many unsent truths had become sediment at its bottom, layering itself until memory and mud were no longer distinguishable. Or maybe it was teaching him something new, that letting go was not always a permanent act, but one that needed to be remembered again and again, like breathing. He walked to the edge, this time with no letter, only observation. He stood not as a visitor, but as someone trying to remember how to listen. The sky above held a softness not tied to time of day. It was neither dusk nor dawn, only gray and kind. He looked into the surface but saw nothing, not even his reflection. The water, usually a mirror, had chosen opacity. He felt no offense, only curiosity. The lake had its own reasons, its own moods, and for the first time, he wondered if it too had secrets, things it had kept from every letter it received, words that floated too deeply to return, emotions it swallowed not because they were offered, but because they had nowhere else to go. He stepped closer, kneeling. The earth was damp, but not muddy. It accepted his weight without a sound. He placed his hand just above the surface, not touching, simply hovering, and in that pause he felt something, small, steady, ancient, a pulse, not his own, not the lake's, but the meeting point between them, the space where sender and receiver no longer mattered, where presence alone was enough. He did not move for a long time. When he finally stood, he left nothing behind. But he took with him something he could not name. The lake had always given without asking, but now it began to withhold, not as punishment, but as invitation, an invitation to reconsider the act of offering itself. Letters had once floated freely, vanishing into stillness with gentle finality, but now they paused. Some spun in place, others returned to shore, as if the lake was asking, "Are you sure? Is this what you meant to release?" People began to hesitate. Some left their envelopes unopened. Others sat by the water and unfolded the pages onto their laps, reading aloud not with voices, but with eyes. The lake, it seemed, wanted more than words. It wanted awareness. He returned on such a day, unsure why. He had no message, no grief, no memory demanding form. Yet something in the stillness of his chest told him the lake had not finished with him. This time he carried only a stone, smooth, oval, the kind children collect and forget. He didn't know where he had picked it up, only that it had stayed in his coat pocket longer than most things ever stayed with him. He held it as he walked, feeling its temperature change with each step, from cool to warm, from heavy to light. It seemed to breathe in time with him. When he reached the shore, he didn't kneel. He sat, cross-legged like a child, stone in hand, thoughts suspended. He did not approach the water. He waited for it to notice him. The breeze curled gently between branches. A single leaf detached from a high branch and spun downward, catching sunlight like a falling answer. He watched it land not on the lake, but beside him. It touched the earth silently and stayed there, as if content to observe. He held the stone above the water, not to drop it, not to offer it, just to show it, to let the lake see what had been carried, not because it needed to, but because it was part of the rhythm now. A rhythm of not letting go blindly, but showing what one might let go of, and waiting to see if the silence agreed. The water responded with a single ripple that did not touch shore, just enough to be seen. He placed the stone gently back into his pocket and rose, not lighter, not heavier, just known. The lake, once a secret known only to the grieving or the brave, began to change in memory more than form. He heard it mentioned in places it had never belonged. On a bench in the city where an old man folded a blank envelope into his coat, in the whispered stories of a child drawing circles in the sand, in the margins of a library book returned with a single sentence underlined. Some waters do not ask you to swim, only to approach. He wondered if the lake had always extended beyond itself, if its presence had never been confined to geography, but had long lived in gestures, in the act of folding paper, in the hesitation before letting something go. He walked the city differently now. Every fountain became a question, every puddle after rain a possibility. He no longer wrote letters, but sometimes he traced shapes on fogged glass, names, thoughts, years, not to remember, but to recognize. He once passed a cafe window and saw a woman holding a small paper crane. She wasn't looking at it, only holding it, gently, like memory itself. Their eyes never met. But in that brief moment he felt the lake stir again. Far away, yes, but attentive, still watching. He wondered then if the lake had ever been a place at all, or if it had simply chosen a location for a while before dissolving into the rituals it had taught. Not every letter needed water now. Some found rest in drawers, under pillows, beneath stones in gardens. The world had begun to write differently, not to be read, but to be felt. He no longer returned to the shore often, but in his pocket, a folded sheet remained, untouched, not for release, not for sharing, but as a reminder that even things unspoken can shape the way one walks. He didn't miss the lake, because it had not left. It had simply spread, like ink on a too thin page, like light in a room without corners. And wherever he carried quiet, it followed. He awoke one night with the distinct sensation that someone had whispered into his ear, though the room was empty and the windows closed. It was not a voice he recognized, nor one he feared, just breath shaped into sound that never arrived. He sat up, unsure whether the echo had come from within or beyond, and in the stillness that followed, he realized he had dreamed not of a place, but of a feeling, the same feeling that had once pulled him to the lake. Only now it was softer, less urgent, more like a suggestion than a call. The dream had not shown water. It had shown paper, sheets floating midair, suspended like leaves in windless sky, each one covered in script that could not be read, but was deeply understood. He remembered none of the words, only the sensation of having already known them. He rose from bed and walked to his small desk, not to write, but to hold a pen. It felt heavier than usual, as if filled with more than ink. He did not open a notebook. He only sat with the pen resting against his palm and closed his eyes. In that stillness he felt the letters, not as characters, but as pulses, small rhythms beneath the skin, like heartbeats with meaning. It occurred to him that writing had always been more physical than intellectual, that each loop of the hand was a form of breath, that every word, even when never read, left a shape in the body. And perhaps the lake had always been responding not to paper, but to these shapes, to the decisions made in silence, to the thoughts wrapped in trembling. He remained at the desk until morning, not moving, not sleeping, just listening. The pen never touched paper, but he rose feeling as though he had written something anyway, and he placed the pen carefully back in its drawer, upright, centered, as if it contained a message not meant to be opened, only acknowledged. There came a day when he no longer folded pages, no longer named feelings, no longer marked time by visits to the lake. But something remained, in the way he paused before discarding a receipt, in the way he smoothed napkins before setting them down, in the way his hand hovered over envelopes, even when empty. He had become a keeper of silent gestures, of invisible offerings. People around him noticed, though none could explain it. Children sat longer near him. Strangers sometimes stopped mid-step, glancing toward him as if they'd forgotten something they were supposed to remember. He never told anyone about the lake, not out of secrecy, but reverence. Some truths were not protected by silence, they were formed by it. When asked why he often walked the long way home, he would smile gently and say, "The short way forgets things." And they would nod, not understanding, but not questioning either. He began to leave small slips of blank paper in odd places, inside returned library books, tucked behind mirrors in public restrooms, beneath loose bricks on old walls. Not with messages, not as riddles, just presence. A reminder that not all communication requires meaning. One afternoon, he stood in the middle of a busy square and let go of a single white page. It floated upward instead of down, windless, yet rising. People passed around him without noticing, but a small boy, barely old enough to speak, pointed upward and laughed, not with amusement, but with recognition. And in that sound he felt something shift again. The lake, perhaps, had changed location. Or perhaps it was now wherever it needed to be. In his final years, he no longer visited the lake. His legs had grown tired, and the path had become steep with time. But the lake had never asked for return. It had only asked to be remembered. He kept a small jar of water on his windowsill. No one knew where it came from. It looked ordinary, but in morning light it shimmered differently, as if it held more than reflection. Some believed it was just glass playing with sun, but he knew, and when he passed, the jar remained, untouched, unclouded, clear as silence. No will was found, no letters, only a drawer of empty envelopes, neatly stacked, blank but deliberate. Those who entered the room felt something unspoken, not grief, not loss, just a hush, as though a voice had just stopped speaking, and everyone had paused to listen for more. The jar eventually disappeared. No one remembered removing it, but the sunlight in the room never fell the same way again. And somewhere far away, where trees leaned into each other without speaking, a lake continued to receive letters it would never return, because it understood that sometimes being seen, truly seen, was enough. The new occupant of the small house on the hill didn't know about the lake. She found the key wedged behind a loose brick on the porch, the kind of hiding place that felt intentional but forgotten. The house had stood empty for years, wrapped in ivy and dust, as if preserving something no one remembered asking it to. She had come from the city with little more than a suitcase and a feeling that she couldn't explain to anyone, least of all herself. People asked why she had chosen this place, this worn cottage with no neighbors and too much quiet. She had no answer, only the sense that something had been waiting, something that had watched her grow tired of traffic lights and mirrored hallways, and the endless blur of faces she didn't know how to miss. Something that had called softly, not in words, but in weight. The house didn't resist her presence. It didn't groan at night or slam doors when the wind picked up. Instead, it adjusted. The floorboards softened beneath her steps. The windows let in light that matched her breathing. Even the creaks in the ceiling came at familiar times, like a rhythm syncing with her own. In the attic, she found a drawer of blank paper, crisp, unused, but yellowing at the edges. No markings, no signs of intent. Yet when she held the pages, she felt a tingling in her fingertips, as if the paper had once meant something and still might. She placed one sheet beside her bed, not to write on, but to listen to. At night, it didn't rustle, but it didn't stay still either. She didn't write at first. She arranged her books, swept the dust into corners, opened windows that hadn't moved in years. She sat for long hours with tea growing cold in her hands, watching the trees sway with conversations she couldn't hear. There was a particular quiet here that unsettled and soothed her at once. Not emptiness, but presence, as if something unseen was listening closely, waiting without impatience. The feeling grew stronger each evening, especially as the sun fell behind the trees and shadows stretched longer than they should. Once, just before dusk, she caught her own reflection in the glass, not looking back, but sideways, as if remembering her from somewhere else. Then one morning, As she opened a drawer looking for candles, she found a single smooth stone tucked neatly among matches. Oval, pale, warm despite the cold. When she held it, a memory stirred. Not hers, but one that felt close, as if passed down through the palms of many hands. A vague sensation of water without waves, of silence that understood language better than sound. She closed her fingers around the stone and stepped outside. She didn't know where she was going, but her feet moved with a certainty she hadn't felt since arriving. Past the back garden, past the rows of overgrown blackberry bushes, past a fence with no gate and a path with no name, until at last the trees began to lean inward, not crowding, but guiding, and there, just beyond the last bend, the lake waited, not surprised, not distant, only ready. The lake did not greet her with grandeur. It did not shimmer or reflect her image. It did not hum or call her name. It simply was, and that was enough to make her pause. She stood at the edge for a long time, unsure whether she had reached a destination or merely wandered into someone else's memory. The trees leaned as if they recognized her shape, not from sight, but from presence. The water was impossibly still, not glassy, but dense, as though it held everything that had ever been said into it, compacted and settled beneath the surface. She stepped forward slowly, each footfall pressing into the soft moss-covered earth. There was no wind, yet her coat shifted as though reacting to a different kind of movement, an atmospheric recognition. She looked down and realized she was holding the stone more tightly than she meant to. Its warmth had faded, but not entirely. It seemed to pulse faintly, like something alive but quiet, respectful of the moment. She opened her hand and let it rest on her palm. A thought passed through her, uninvited but gentle. You've come before, even if not like this. There was no bench, no path, no dock, only the edge and what lay beyond it. She sat down, legs tucked beneath her, and stared at the lake without expectation. It gave her nothing, and yet she felt full, not of answers, but of space, the kind of interior room one finds only after grief has packed and moved out. She did not cry. She did not smile. She only listened to the sound of a world that made no noise and yet was not silent. Behind her, birds moved without singing. Above, clouds hovered without changing shape. And inside, her breath found a slower rhythm. She stayed until her legs tingled with stillness. Then, without decision, she placed the stone beside her on the ground. Not in the water, not offered, just there. It didn't roll or sink. It simply remained. And in that gesture, she understood something, not as knowledge, but as memory. This place was not for letting go. It was for allowing weight to become shape, allowing silence to become language, allowing the unseen to be seen without question. As she stood to leave, she looked once more at the lake. It hadn't moved. And yet, it felt closer. In the days that followed, she found herself returning to the lake without trying to. Her walks began as errands, picking herbs near the stone wall, checking on the creaking shed, stretching legs stiffened by quiet hours indoors. But somehow, each path curved gently toward that hidden bend between the trees. She never forced it. She never named it. The lake did not become her habit. It became her horizon. The place every gaze eventually reached, whether her eyes looked for it or not. Each time she arrived, she carried nothing, not even thoughts. The lake seemed to prefer it that way. She never saw animals near it. No frogs, no insects, not even birds resting on its branches. And yet, it didn't feel lifeless. It felt inhabited in a different way, as if memory itself dwelled here, quietly breathing beneath the surface. Sometimes she brought a notebook, not to write in, but to hold. Its pages remained empty, but warmed slightly in her lap as she sat. Once, she opened it and let the wind turn a single page, then closed it again. That was enough. The lake asked for nothing more. She noticed the stone still sitting where she had left it, untouched by rain or moss or time. It no longer felt like hers, and that was strangely comforting. Ownership had always been heavier than she liked. The stone now belonged to the space, and to whatever conversation it continued without her. One evening, just before dusk, she saw something she had never seen before. A letter, pale and soft, floating silently toward the center of the lake. There was no one else around, no breeze, no hand that had placed it there. It simply was. She didn't react, didn't lean forward, just observed, breathing slowly as the envelope spun once, then again, then slipped beneath the surface without rippling. It was gone, not lost, not consumed, just somewhere else now. That night, she dreamed of blank pages floating above her bed, hovering like soft lanterns that gave off no light but still illuminated everything she had once forgotten. When she woke, the notebook on her bedside table was open to a page she did not recall touching. At the bottom corner, a faint shape had formed, not writing, not an image, but something like the curve of a wave drawn by memory itself. She began to notice echoes, not the kind that bounce off stone, but the kind that press inward. They showed up in the way her hand hesitated above drawers, the way she reached for a cup only to pause and choose a different one, the way her footsteps changed cadence before she even realized she was near the lake again. The world around her began to behave like memory, repeating itself, not identically, but with intention. The clouds gathered in shapes she had once seen in childhood. A breeze passed by, smelling faintly of someone she had never met but missed nonetheless. In her kitchen, she found a slip of paper tucked into an old book she didn't remember owning. It had no writing, just a corner folded inward. She didn't unfold it. She simply placed it on the windowsill where morning light could reach it. Later that week, she found a different slip beneath the doormat, weighted by a pebble that had not been there the day before. The page was damp, curling, as if it had once been submerged, then retrieved before it forgot too much. She did not feel watched. She felt accompanied, as if the house, the trees, the water had begun to respond. Not dramatically, but gently, like a breath held just a little longer after waking. Each day she woke earlier, not from restlessness but anticipation. Not for something to happen, but for something to continue. She walked the edges of the lake and sometimes saw ripples with no source. Once she watched a shadow pass beneath the surface. Long, slow, deliberate. It did not frighten her. It only deepened her stillness. That night, she lit a candle and placed it beside the stone on the windowsill. The flame did not flicker, but at some point, though she had not seen it happen, the folded slip of paper had opened. Its corner no longer bent. In its center, a small watermark had appeared, barely visible, like something whispered across distance. She didn't need to know what it meant. She only whispered thank you into the room, not as a message, but as a recognition. The season turned slowly. Leaves began to fall, not all at once, but in a pattern that felt chosen. Each morning brought one more color to the trees, each evening a touch more wind. She didn't mind the chill. It felt like a coat she had worn once long ago and forgotten how much she missed. The lake remained unchanged. Or perhaps it changed constantly in ways only silence could detect. She had stopped trying to interpret it. She now treated it like a person one trusts too deeply to question. Each visit became less about arriving and more about being near. She no longer brought anything with her, no paper, no stones, no books. Her presence was offering enough. She began to hum as she walked, though she didn't notice it at first. The tune had no structure, just a string of notes that followed her breath. Once, as she knelt beside the lake, she heard the same tune repeated, faint, distant, not an echo, but an answer. She didn't search for the source. Some sounds are meant to be received, not investigated. That night she dreamed again. This time she stood knee-deep in the lake, though the water was not cold. Around her floated hundreds of folded pages, drifting slowly like autumn leaves across a still pond. None opened, none sank. She didn't touch them. She only stood, arms at her sides, eyes closed. And as she breathed, the pages began to rise, not into the air, but into light. Soft columns of glow rising from each envelope, vanishing upward like prayers not aimed at gods, but at memory itself. She woke before dawn, hands warm, heart still humming, and when she stepped outside, the lake was invisible in fog. But she walked to it anyway, barefoot in the grass. The fog did not hide it. It revealed it differently, as if saying, "You have known it all along." Snow came quietly. No storm, no warning. Just a morning where everything had softened. The trees held white in their arms like slow exhalations. The lake, half frozen, reflected only sky. She stood at its edge wrapped in layers, breath forming small clouds that hovered before fading. There were no footprints, no signs of animals, only her and the hush that had settled over everything. She sat, despite the cold, and waited, not for something to appear, but for something to be felt. And it came, not in sound or image, but in warmth. A warmth beneath her ribs, spreading gently, the kind that memory sometimes brings when it no longer aches. Beside her in the snow was the stone, not where she had left it months before, but here, now, at her side, half covered in powder, but unmistakable. She did not pick it up. She only placed her gloved hand near it, not touching, just letting it share space. And for a long while they remained like that, woman, lake, stone, unmoving, held together by something more permanent than shape. When she finally stood, she turned not toward the path but toward the trees, and for the first time she walked a different direction. The lake did not call her back. It only watched, still and knowing. As she disappeared beyond the line of trunks, a single flake of snow landed where she had sat, and melted not from heat, but memory. The house had not changed, or perhaps it had, and she had changed with it, so the rhythm remained. The same floorboard still creaked under the window at dawn. The kettle still hissed with steam before it boiled. The drawer with blank pages still offered more, though she never remembered buying any. But something had shifted, subtly, like the tilt of light through a dusty curtain. The quiet in the house was no longer empty. It was layered, as though the walls had learned to listen better, and in doing so, had begun to remember. She had stopped going to the lake daily, not because she no longer needed it, but because the lake now lived closer. Its stillness had seeped into her breathing, its patience into her bones. She found echoes of it in the way she stirred tea, in the way her fingers hovered above a doorknob before opening, in the way she paused at the edge of sleep each night, waiting for nothing, but honoring the pause anyway. She no longer expected presence to announce itself. She had learned to meet it halfway. One afternoon, while pruning the wild ivy that clung stubbornly to the fence, she found something tucked into a knot in the wood. A letter, folded twice, yellowed but intact. No name, no address. She turned it over, hesitated, then placed it in her pocket without opening it. There was no urgency, no fear. It felt like finding a seashell on a sidewalk. Not wrong, just oddly placed. She finished her work, wiped her hands, and returned inside. The letter remained on the kitchen table for 3 days, untouched, yet somehow participating in every moment. When she read, it waited. When she washed dishes, it watched. When she slept, it rested. On the 4th morning, she sat down with her tea and unfolded it. The ink was faded but legible. The words were not addressed to her, and yet she felt each one settle into her chest as if it had known her shape. The letter did not tell a story. It described a moment, a single, silent moment at the edge of a lake where someone had once let go of something too light to hold and too heavy to carry. There were no names, no places, only feeling, only weight, only stillness. She folded it again and placed it in a jar on her windowsill, beside the stone and a dried petal she had never meant to keep. The jar did not feel like storage. It felt like memory choosing a shape, and when the wind moved through the room later that day, it passed around the jar without disturbing it, like breath moving around something sacred. She began placing small things into jars, not keepsakes, not souvenirs, but pieces of presents. A loose thread from an old sweater, a button that had come off with no sound, a dried stem from a flower she hadn't remembered placing on the windowsill. They weren't arranged by date or meaning. They weren't labeled. Each one simply existed, suspended in glass, where they could be seen without being explained. The jars weren't a collection. They were a way of remembering gently, without pressing too hard. The letter in the first jar began to fade, not in color, but in sharpness. The edges curled a little more each day. The ink softened into the fibers, but every morning, when the light hit the jar just right, the page still appeared whole, as if the glass itself preserved not the paper, but the moment it carried. She never tried to write back. The letter didn't ask for a reply. It had come not to be answered, but to be held. One day, while walking past the tree line, she noticed a new path. Narrow, barely marked, just the slightest disturbance in the fallen leaves. She didn't follow it, not out of fear, but patience. Some paths are only meant to be seen once, but that evening, she left a blank page on her windowsill beside the jar. No message, no intent, just a folded corner, bent as if it had already traveled somewhere. In the morning, the page was gone. She searched gently, not frantically. The window had not opened. The wind had not blown, but the space where the paper had rested felt emptied with care, as though taken, not stolen, removed by something that knew not to wake her. She did not feel intrusion. She felt completion. That evening she placed another page in the same spot, folded, corner turned. And in her sleep, she dreamed of hands she did not recognize gently lifting words she had never written. The blank pages continued to disappear, one each night, always folded the same way, always gone by morning. She never heard footsteps, never saw movement in the garden, but each time the air in the room felt lighter, as if something unspoken had been lifted. There was no fear, only rhythm. It became part of her evening, boiling water, brushing her hair, folding a page, leaving it by the jar. Not ritual, not offering, just quiet conversation with something that never asked her name. One morning she found something in return, not where the paper had been, but in the center of the room, just beneath the window's shadow. A petal, pale pink, fresh, soft to the touch. It had no scent, but it reminded her of rain before it falls, how it hangs in the air with weight but no shape. She placed it inside one of the jars without thinking, beside the button, the thread, the memory she had never needed to explain. That evening, she folded another page, and the cycle continued. Weeks passed, and the jars multiplied, not in number but in significance. Some stayed empty, some filled slowly, others rearranged themselves overnight. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts, like breath in sleep. She began to notice other things too. The sound of her footsteps softened. Her shadow no longer moved in sync with her body. When she stood at the window, it sometimes hesitated a moment longer, as if still remembering something she had already forgotten. She no longer spoke out loud. Words felt heavy in the air, like stones dropped into still water. But she didn't miss them. Everything she needed to say had already found its way into the pages, into the jars, into the silence that now wrapped around her like a second skin. The house did not feel haunted. It felt inhabited, by time, by memory, by the quiet continuation of something older than story. The lake had not been visited in months, not by her feet, not by her thoughts, and yet it remained vivid in her senses, like a scent embedded in fabric, or a song half heard in sleep. The absence did not feel like neglect. It felt like trust. She no longer needed to return to know it was there. She could feel it in the way the glass cooled at dusk, in the way her breath deepened without prompting, in the way her fingers sometimes traced invisible ripples across the table's surface. One afternoon, she opened a cabinet she had never opened before. Inside were dozens of envelopes, unsealed, stacked neatly. None had names, none had dates. She didn't remember placing them there. But when she reached for one, it felt familiar. The paper was heavier than her own, slightly textured like something handmade. She placed the envelope on the table and didn't open it. Instead, she sat beside it until the sun left the room. And in that shadow, something stirred. Not in the paper, not in the house, but in her chest. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't joy. It was the sensation of having been seen, not by someone, not by anything, but by time itself. As if the years had quietly watched her become and now gently acknowledged her presence. She folded the envelope again, though it had never been unfolded, and placed it on the windowsill with the others. It did not disappear that night. It stayed, watching as she slept without dreams. In the morning, it was still there, but the air smelled of water. The weather turned slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the balance. A softer cold crept into the rooms, clinging not to the walls, but to memory. The jars on the windowsill fogged slightly with breath each morning, though the glass never showed condensation. Her hands began to move more slowly, not from stiffness, but from precision. She lit fewer candles. She needed less light. The dark was not absence anymore. It was comfort. One night, she folded 2 pages instead of 1, not from decision, but from instinct. She placed them side by side on the wooden sill, letting the moonlight rest upon them evenly. When she woke, only one had vanished. The other remained, slightly open, as if reconsidering its purpose. She left it there. The next night, she added another page, this time with a pressed leaf folded inside. Still, only one disappeared. It continued this way. The lake, or whatever now received, took only what it chose. Some pages remained for days, others vanished before dawn. She began to learn from the selection. Some things were ready, others were not. Some memories, even when offered, needed more time to unfold. She stopped trying to guess which would be taken. Instead, she folded each with equal care and let them decide their own endings. On the first frost of the season, she found a jar she didn't recognize among her own. Inside was nothing but air. But when she lifted the lid, her eyes stung with a sudden ache, like breathing in winter before it's fully arrived. She closed the jar gently and placed it in the center of the shelf. Not to be touched again, but to be acknowledged. Some memories, she now understood, returned in the form of weather. The last time she saw the lake, it was not by choice. She had been walking without direction, as she often did in the final days of autumn, following paths not to reach a place, but to inhabit emotion. The trees were nearly bare, their branches drawing lines across a pale sky. The air was cold, but dry, crisp in a way that made her lungs feel clearer than usual. The silence was heavy, but it welcomed her. She turned a corner, one she didn't recall turning before, and there it was, still, unchanged because it had changed beyond recognition. The lake no longer shimmered. It didn't reflect the sky, it absorbed it. The surface was smooth, but not empty. It held something deep, something full, something unspoken. She stood there for a long time, unsure if she had returned, or if it had come to her. She didn't step closer. She didn't kneel. She simply stood at the edge, arms at her sides, eyes open, and in that stillness, she felt all the pages she had ever folded, all the jars she had ever filled, all the breaths she had ever given to silence return, not as objects, not even as memories, but as presence. A presence that did not belong to her alone, a presence that had been waiting for her to stop searching. She turned back before the sun fully set, walked home slowly. That night, no pages were placed on the windowsill. No candles were lit. But in the morning, a jar sat on the floor beside her bed. Inside was a single folded page, blank, but warm. Winter settled not as a force, but as a memory returning. The house did not resist the cold. It welcomed it like an old friend coming to visit without baggage, only silence. The windows frosted lightly each morning, forming patterns that resembled handwriting lost in translation. Her breath became slower, longer. Each step across the wooden floor sounded deeper, as if the planks had learned to echo rather than creak. The jars by the windowsill remained untouched, their contents resting beneath thin veils of condensation that disappeared before noon. She no longer counted the days. Time had softened into a rhythm that moved without dividing. One morning, she woke with a strange calm, the kind that precedes something inevitable but not unwanted. She rose slowly, folded a page as always, but instead of placing it on the sill, she held it in her hand and sat beside it. The page was empty, yet it hummed, not audibly, but in the skin of her fingers. It felt warmer than the air. She didn't let it go. Not yet. She held it all morning, walking through the house, pausing by each jar as if saying farewell without words. There was one jar she always avoided, not because of fear, but because she felt uninvited. It sat alone on a shelf apart from the others, smaller, thicker glass, sealed tightly. She had no memory of placing anything in it. And yet, it felt complete. This morning, as the snow whispered softly outside, she stood before it for a long time. She did not open it. She only placed her folded page beside it, and in doing so, felt a knot in her chest loosen. One she hadn't known was there. Later that day, she walked through the orchard behind the house, where only dry stems remained. The sky was pale, without sun, but not empty. She stopped by a tree stump and sat without discomfort, letting her breath trail ahead of her like an invisible thread. The lake was far behind, beyond the trees and time, but she no longer needed to see it. Its silence echoed in the hollows of her bones, and in that stillness, she felt more accompanied than alone. When she returned inside, the folded page was gone, the jar untouched. That night, the wind changed. It wasn't louder or colder. It simply carried something different, a texture in the air, a weightless pressure brushing across her cheekbones as she stood by the window. A shift that didn't come with sound, but with the certainty that something had moved. She sat at the table long after the candles had gone out, watching the shadows drift slowly across the floor. They didn't rush, didn't flicker, didn't dance. They moved like thoughts she hadn't thought yet, like stories waiting just beneath her ribs. It was the kind of knowledge only carried by something that had seen everything and chosen to remain silent. She didn't reach for anything. The folded page that had disappeared earlier didn't return, but she felt its echo lingering, not on the table, but inside her, a shape still warm. She dreamed of the lake again, but not as water. This time it had become a room, circular, vast, without walls or ceiling, its edges made not of wood or stone, but of glistening ink. The floor beneath her was soft and yielding, yet it held her weight like memory holds footsteps. At the center stood a single chair carved from nothing, and resting on it, an envelope, sealed, pale as breath. She didn't walk toward it. She sat beside it, across from it, letting her own breathing align with its stillness. It didn't need to be opened. Its presence was enough. When she woke, her fingers smelled faintly of rain, though no window had been open, and her hands had not touched water in days. The next morning, she stood before the shelf of jars, not looking at them, but through them. Their outlines shimmered slightly in the low light. The air seemed thicker around them, as if each one exhaled something invisible. She didn't open any of them. She didn't need to. Each glass body radiated a quiet weight, not the heaviness of sorrow, but the density of memory that has settled without demand. She lifted one, light, hollow, almost empty, and held it gently to her ear. There was no sound, but within its silence, she sensed something soft, a word unspoken, a breath withheld, a promise never broken because it had never needed to be made. She returned it carefully to the shelf and turned toward the door. Her boots waited by the threshold, still dusted with days long past. She sat down slowly and laced them, not with urgency, but with reverence. Her hands moved steadily, each loop of the lace a kind of unspoken sentence. Today, she would return to the lake, not because it had called her, not because anything was unfinished, but because deep within, She had remembered something simple and quiet. She had never truly left. The path to the lake had changed. It no longer resembled the soft trail she once followed between trees and memory. It had become quieter, not empty, but reverent. The moss still clung to the edges of fallen branches, but the ground beneath her boots felt different now, more yielding, less concerned with direction. There were no tracks in the snow, no evidence of her or anyone else. But her steps did not falter. She moved forward, not because she remembered the way, but because her breath did. It was not her feet leading her. It was something older within her, something that had always known the weight and rhythm of return. The trees stood tall and still, not bracing against the cold, but watching it pass through them. Their limbs arched overhead like a canopy of intention. They did not move. No wind stirred them. No sound broke the frozen air. But she felt acknowledged with every step, as if their stillness leaned into her presence without asking her name. She didn't rush. Each footfall was a part of something unfolding. Each breath aligned with the stillness around her. Even her shadow moved more slowly now, following behind not as reflection, but as witness. When the lake appeared between the branches, it was different, not unrecognizable, but quieter still. Frozen along the edges, its surface offered no reflection, no glint of sun, just a field of silver holding the shape of sky. It did not shimmer. It did not ripple. It simply absorbed the horizon and made it still. She stopped at the edge, hands in her coat pockets, breath softening into the cold. Beneath the surface, she saw a cluster of leaves, trapped in ice, motionless, and yet not lost. Their presence felt intentional, like a message written in a language beyond words. She knelt slowly, her knees settling into the thin layer of snow. Reaching forward, she placed her fingertips lightly against the ice. It stung gently, a cold that spoke without malice. And there, just for a moment, she felt something. Beneath the glassy surface, a pulse, not loud, not firm, but present. One slow beat, then stillness again. She didn't recoil. She only closed her eyes and breathed in, letting that one moment echo through her bones. From inside her coat, she withdrew the folded page she had carried. It was warm, unwritten, quiet. She didn't press it to the lake. She didn't ask it to vanish. She let it go into the air, where the wind, newly arrived, as if waiting for this gesture, gathered it gently. The page drifted, hovered, turned once in the sky, and descended not upon the lake, but just beside it, where a stone lay half buried beneath snow. It landed without sound. She stood. She did not retrieve it. Some pages are meant to rest where memory chooses, not where hands decide. On her way back, the forest felt different. It was not the trees themselves that had changed, nor the snow underfoot, nor the fading light above the canopy. It was the way the space between all those things had widened. There was more air between the branches now, more pause between the steps she took and the sounds they didn't make. The light had begun to stretch, not with urgency, but with intention, pouring long shadows across the ground like memories that had settled too deeply to leave. She moved more slowly, not because of fatigue, but because movement itself now felt sacred. She paused beside a tree she didn't recognize. Not new, not freshly grown, but unfamiliar in the way some feelings are. Its bark bore marks, not letters, not symbols, but grooves shaped like the lines of a story someone had once started and then left unfinished. She reached out and pressed her palm against the trunk. Beneath the layers of time and lichen, there was a vibration, low, steady, like the hum of a breath, held just before a word. She didn't try to interpret it. Some things speak best in silence. She simply stood there until the chill in her glove softened, and something quiet passed between her skin and the wood. By the time she reached the edge of the orchard, the sun had nearly set. The house stood in its usual place, but it felt newly still, not dormant, not distant, just deeply present, like a friend who listens without speaking. Inside, the air was warmer than she expected, not by fire, not by heater, but by presence. The jars on the shelf shimmered faintly, not from any light within, but from what they reflected. It was as if something she had carried from the lake now hovered just above the room, visible only in the way dust hangs before dusk. She didn't light a candle. She didn't need to. The quiet was complete. Each step she took felt like it left no trace. She moved through the house not as a person returning, but as someone joining something already in progress. The room had not waited for her. It had simply continued breathing while she was gone. She sat beside the window, but did not place a page upon the sill. Her hands rested on her lap, open, still. Later that night, long after she had fallen asleep in the chair without intending to, she woke. Not to a sound, not to a movement, but to a feeling. At the edge of the room, something had arrived. It didn't move closer. It didn't demand attention. It was simply there, unseen, unnamed, familiar. She didn't open her eyes. She only turned her face in its direction and exhaled a long, slow breath. The air around her shifted slightly, as if responding. Then everything returned to stillness, and that was enough. In the days that followed, she did not return to the lake. Not because she had forgotten it, nor because its meaning had faded, but because the lake had begun appearing elsewhere, quietly, insistently, in places where water did not belong. She would find its shimmer in the condensation clinging to her drinking glass, see the hush of its surface in the unmoving eyes of the teacup left untouched for hours. It lingered in the window panes during dawn, not as reflection, but as presence. She didn't reach for it. She didn't try to capture it. She simply allowed it to appear, without expectation, without question. Its echoes revealed themselves in moments too brief for language. The slight tremble of her hand before reaching for a long-forgotten object. The weight of stillness in her chest when she paused at a doorway and forgot what she had intended to do. The way certain rooms now held more silence than others. It was no longer just a place she had visited. It had become a rhythm she moved within. The lake had found a new shoreline, within her breath, between her bones, around the quiet curves of her thoughts. She found herself growing more careful with sound, not out of fear, but reverence. She closed drawers gently. She folded pages more slowly. Even the act of setting a cup on a table became a deliberate ritual, as if the objects themselves deserved not to be startled. There was a sense now that anything too loud might erase something delicate that was still forming in the air. The quiet had taken on texture, like fog that could be felt. It moved around her not as emptiness, but as memory without shape. One morning, as she stirred honey into tea, the spoon clinked faintly against porcelain. And in that soft collision, she heard something. Familiar, not in sound, but in feeling. As if someone had once done the same beside her, long ago. She didn't look up, didn't seek confirmation. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't longing. It was recognition of something that had once happened, or maybe never had, but whose echo fit perfectly in the present. At night, the house grew quieter still. Even the floorboards stopped their usual shifting. The walls no longer creaked when the wind turned. It was as though the house itself had begun listening, not to her, but to the same thing she had begun hearing. The subtle murmur of something vast, wordless, and impossibly gentle. Something that was always present, but only now allowed itself to be noticed. She no longer tried to remember what the page had said, or whether it had ever said anything at all. Its meaning, like the lake, was not in content, but in presence. It was a space, a stillness, a recognition. And wherever she went now, that space followed. Not behind her, not ahead, but just beside, like a breath she hadn't yet taken, but already knew. She woke on the final morning with a kind of clarity that was not sharp or sudden, but soft, like the slow unveiling of light across snow. It was not clarity of purpose, not direction, nor even understanding. It was simply presence, the awareness of being within a moment that did not require anything more. Her body felt light, unburdened not by rest, but by something more enduring, the sense that whatever she had been holding quietly within her for all those years had finally found space to rest. The light in the room was different. It came not from the window alone, but from the walls themselves, as if the air had learned how to glow. Outside, the snow still lay thick, unmoved, untroubled, but inside, warmth settled across the floorboards with no visible source. There was no fire, no sunbeam, no candle lit, yet the air held a hum, not sound exactly, but the memory of one, as though someone had sung softly in the room hours ago, and the silence still remembered the melody. She rose without effort, her movements unhurried, each step part of something whole. The wood beneath her feet creaked not with age, but with acknowledgement. She ran her hand along the shelf of jars. Some were empty, some remained sealed. She didn't check which. They had become more than containers. They were part of the stillness now, part of the space that no longer asked to be named. In the corner of the room sat the chair she rarely used, but today she walked toward it with quiet certainty. She sat, not to rest, not to reflect, but simply to be, her hands folded gently in her lap, her eyes closed, but not in retreat. In the silence that followed, there was no sense of ending, no farewell, only continuity, as though what had once been a story held in letters and water had now become something formless, something that breathed with her rather than apart from her. From the distance, though she did not know whether it was in memory or in space or in the strange overlap where the two blur, she felt the lake exhale, a long, slow breath, not of cold, not of sorrow, but of completion, as if it too had waited for this moment, as if the pages it had once cradled, the letters it had once carried, had finally reached their intended reader, even if the words themselves had never been written. And in that moment, with the light wrapping gently around her shoulders, she understood. There are some stories that do not end. They simply change form. They become rooms, reflections, textures in the air. They become hands that do not reach, but remember. They become the silence after the last page is turned, when the story is no longer told, but lived. She didn't move again that morning. She didn't need to. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, something vast and quiet continued to stay. There was no announcement, no sign that something had shifted. Only the sense, so slight it almost went unnoticed, that the days had begun to feel longer, not in hours, but in depth. Time did not stretch forward. It deepened, as if the hours no longer passed by, but gently folded over each other, like linens stacked in a drawer, soft with use and memory. She no longer checked the calendar. The numbered squares had stopped holding meaning. Instead, she followed the subtle language of light, the angle it entered the room, the color it carried on her skin, the length of her own shadow at rest. This was how she knew the season had turned, even if the snow remained unmelted. The lake no longer called her back. It didn't need to. It had already crossed the invisible line between outside and within. Now, it lived in her hands when she touched the window pane, in the quiet moments just before sleep, in the hush between one breath and the next. She didn't think of it as a place anymore. It had become a companion, not following, not preceding, but residing. It was not memory, not symbol, not even feeling. It was presence without need. And like all things that no longer needed to speak, it had grown louder in its silence. In the attic, where old things once slumbered beneath sheets and time, she began to notice dust settling differently. Not more, not less. Just gentler. As though the air itself was cushioning what had been forgotten. She never opened the boxes, not from avoidance, not from fear, but from a kind of agreement between herself and the past, that not everything needed remembering to be held. Some objects kept their stories better when untouched. The shape of them, the weight of their waiting, was enough. Occasionally she found herself at the edge of writing, a pen in hand, a blank page open, the air around her poised. But the letters never came, and it didn't trouble her. She had come to understand that not every silence begged to be broken. Some silences were whole, complete, not lacking words, but beyond them. She didn't need to mark the page for the moment to have meaning. The stillness was the mark. At dusk, the sky sometimes turned the color of faded ink, not blue, not gray, but the space between, like something once written now, lost to time and water. On those evenings, she would sit by the window and feel the house breathing with her, not in rhythm, not in harmony, but in recognition. Two forms of stillness, sharing space without explanation. And in all of this, these pages unwritten, these objects untouched, this lake unvisited, she felt, for the first time, fully known. She had begun to move differently through the house, not slower exactly, but with a kind of deliberateness that made each gesture feel rooted. Closing a cupboard became a moment of intention. Pouring water into a glass felt like completing a circle. Even walking down the hallway was no longer a transition between rooms, but a passage in itself. There was no need to rush, because there was no longer anything she was trying to reach. The space between steps mattered more than the destination. And with every movement, she seemed to leave behind less of herself, as if the house already remembered her well enough. Sometimes she would stand at the threshold of a room and not enter, not because she didn't want to, but because the doorway felt complete. Enough. It was not about what lay inside anymore. It was about standing still and realizing that the act of not crossing over was also part of living. She could feel the presence of what the room held. Its quiet, its dust, its light slanting across worn furniture, and that was sufficient. To see was not always to touch. To know was not always to act. She noticed that the shadows in the house had softened, not vanished, but faded around the edges, as though even darkness had grown gentle. Corners no longer held their sharpness. The night didn't arrive with a clear line anymore. It seeped in like ink on cloth, absorbing rather than replacing. And in that gradual shift, she felt something ease in her chest, as if her own shadow too had loosened its definition, no longer needing to follow her so precisely. The jars remained where they had always been. She never counted them, never opened one, but she often found herself running a hand along their cool surfaces, fingers brushing glass like braille for a language she no longer needed to read. They weren't containers now, they were presences, and though she didn't recall what each had once held, if they had held anything at all, she trusted that they remembered for her. That was enough. She had stopped asking the sky for signs. It gave them anyway, in the way clouds paused above the orchard, or how frost etched new shapes on the window each morning. She no longer tried to interpret these messages. They were not puzzles to be solved. They were simply acknowledgments. The world waving gently across a quiet room saying, "Yes, I see you." And that was all she needed. The snow did not melt, but it no longer blanketed the world in the same way. It had become translucent in feeling, less a covering, more a layer between seasons. Birds did not return, yet she sensed their memory in the air, like a song that had once filled the trees and still vibrated in the absence. The lake remained out of sight, but it lingered in her gestures, in the way she set down a cup, or folded a blanket, or stood still at the foot of her bed without needing to lie down. One evening, she lit a candle not out of necessity, but to mark time. The flame was small, shy, almost reluctant. It flickered not from wind, but from recognition. The air around it did not stir, and yet the light danced, not casting shadows, but making space. She watched it without expectation. Its presence was enough. No warmth, no scent. Just the soft reminder that something could still glow even when the day had no edges. The mirror in the hallway, long covered in a thin cloth, was no longer something to avoid. She passed it as she always had, without glancing in. But now she felt its presence differently. It was not a reflection waiting to be seen. It had become a doorway not to anywhere else, but to stillness. A a quiet surface that held light, but not her face. She did not need to see herself. She knew she was there. That knowing had become quieter, more complete. At night, she sometimes awoke not from dreams, but from the absence of them, as though her sleep had not been disturbed, but gently turned inside out. She would lie still, not fully awake, not still asleep. In that in-between, she felt closest to the lake, not in sight, not in sound, but in weight. A gentle gravity that pulled nothing down but made everything rest. Even her breath became softer then, shaped by something older than lungs. The pages she once wrote had long been tucked away, not hidden, not abandoned, but simply quieted. Sometimes she imagined them slipping from their resting place and fluttering open in the dark, revealing words that no longer needed her to read them. They were no longer hers. They belonged to the air, to the house, to whatever had always been listening. And when the candle finally burned out, she didn't light another. One morning she noticed something strange. A glass on the table had gathered condensation, though the room was not cold. A ring of water circled the base, delicate and uncaused. She didn't reach to wipe it. Instead, she leaned in and watched it form, slowly, with patience, like a message returning. It reminded her of the lake, not in appearance but in behavior. A quiet offering, a sentence without words. She understood it completely. She no longer marked time in days. Instead, she began marking it in moments of stillness. The way dust moved when no window was open, the quiet shift in light on the stairwell, the way the floor groaned in the same spot every evening, even when she hadn't stepped there. The house had become its own kind of clock, measuring not the passage of hours, but the density of presence. And in that measure she found a different kind of rhythm, one she did not control, one she did not need to. She moved through the rooms like breath through a song, brief, necessary, then gone. Nothing called her to stay. Nothing urged her to leave. Her body had become part of the furniture, not in stillness, but in function. She no longer felt separate from the house. She had become one of its rooms, and the lake, once a destination, had become the current running beneath it all, not wet, not visible, but present. At the back of the hallway, behind the old door she had never opened, a draft began to appear, not cold, not invasive, just present, as though the door no longer wished to be a boundary. She stood before it many evenings, hand resting on the knob, never turning it. The act of standing there became its own kind of arrival. Not everything, she understood now, needs to be opened, to be entered. In that house, in that silence, in the echo of pages no longer written, she began to disappear, not in loss, but in presence. She was not fading. She was becoming part of what did not need names, and in that vanishing, she was not alone. She was home. There came a morning when everything felt paused, not stopped, not stilled, but paused, like a breath held mid-inhale. The house did not creak. The clock did not tick. Even the wind outside seemed to wait at the edge of sound. She stood in the center of her room, not startled, not expectant, but aware. It was as if the world had gently placed a hand on her shoulder, not to guide, not to restrain, but simply to say, now. The floor beneath her felt less solid, not because it wavered, but because her weight upon it had changed. She no longer left footprints in dust. The glass did not fog beneath her breath. The mirror showed only the room behind her, never the outline of her form. She did not fear it. She did not question it. There was no ceremony, no farewell, only this new texture of existing, thinner, quieter, more folded into the fabric of space itself. She passed by the shelves and paused at the familiar jars. One of them, a small one, tucked near the corner, seemed to hold light. Not a glow, not a shine, but something gentler, a shimmer that moved only when not looked at directly. She reached out, not to open, but to rest her fingers on its lid. It was warm, and in that warmth she felt the echo of a letter never written, a sentence never spoken, but heard all the same. She let her hand fall away, knowing it had been received. Downstairs, the chair by the window stood empty. She did not sit. She stood behind it, watching the light slant across the floor, touching dust, catching threads in the air. The room was not lonely. It was not expectant. It was simply present, like a note sustained beyond its sound, vibrating gently against the world's quiet. In the garden beyond the glass, snow had begun to soften. Not melt, soften, as if it too was loosening its grip. The trees did not bud, the birds did not return, but there was a sense, not of change, but of continuation, as if spring would not come loudly this year, but hum beneath the soil like a memory waking slowly. And she remained, though not as before. She was not visible now, not entirely. But if one listened closely, beneath the boards, behind the glass, between the sigh of walls, there was presence, not ghost, not absence, just her, still here. There was a silence now that filled the house like light. It did not arrive. It had always been there, waiting for everything else to quiet enough to be heard. It lived in the spaces between, the breath not taken, the door not opened, the step not made. It was not heavy. It did not settle like dust. It shimmered like something remembered without effort. In that silence, the lake returned, not in form, not in image, but in essence. It rippled through the corners of the house, folding into shadows, gliding beneath the seams of rugs, glancing off the edges of jars. It was no longer separate, no longer something outside to be approached. The lake had become the space between heartbeats, the breath she forgot to take, the hush in a room after someone whispers goodbye. Letters no longer floated on its surface. There were no pages left to read. The stories had long dissolved, word by word, into the water, into the air, into the grain of wood and the folds of blankets. But the meaning, unwritten, unspoken, remained. She did not need to remember. She had become the remembering. The house did not echo with her footsteps. It hummed with her being. Visitors would pass through in years to come. They might speak of cold or quiet, of strange drafts or odd reflections. They would wonder at the shelves of sealed jars, the candle that had burned down long ago, the footprints that only led into rooms but never out. They would not understand the stillness. They would misname it. They would say the house was abandoned, that no one lived there anymore, but some would feel it. A pause on the stairs, a warmth near the window, a presence that did not press, only welcomed. And if they stood very still, very quiet, they might hear it too, the soft rustle of paper not turning, the sigh of water without wind. The lake had never been just a place. It was a promise, a threshold, a mirror that offered not reflection, but memory. And she had crossed it not by stepping forward, but by standing still. The stories were gone now, but the silence stayed.